Hey, greetings, friends, and welcome to week 4. This is going to be lecture 1 for this week. This week will cover probably 3 or 4 different lectures that I think will all sort of tie in together fairly nicely. Thus far in the course, we've navigated the first 3 weeks. We've embraced the sort of changes and atmosphere that we find ourselves, this complexity that you and I are navigating. We have explored the cosmological structures that shape our engagement with the world. And we've begun to make some of the necessary shifts in which we begin to think differently about what we've experienced, how we've interpreted some of the challenges of ministry. And I've got really a lot more that I could say, especially about the shifts, though I teach a missional theology course in this program. And I don't want to say too much because I do have students in this class that are going to be taking that course next, and so I don't want to rehash too much of what they'll be learning in that next course. But there's some other shifts that we need to be mindful of as we think about what does the church mean in this era, in this time? What is the nature of the shift to the missional church? And I would encourage you, if you get an opportunity, to pick up Christopher Wright's The Mission of God, which is an incredible text that helps us to develop a missional hermeneutic. And I also invite you to get Michael Goheen's book, A Light to the Nations, which is about a missional ecclesiology, or a missional view of the church. And these are incredibly important shifts in the culture in which we live in that often assumed that the church existed as an entity that folks sort of gravitated towards. Like at the center of American society stood the church. But I think we're living in a time where those assumptions are no longer adequate or even viable. That we've got to re-envision what the church means as not a place or a people that stands at the center of society, that society sort of moves towards. I think we have to begin to understand it as a group of people sent out into the world on mission into the world for the sake of the kingdom of God. And so there's some significant shifts that I think that requires of us. In this week's lectures, we're going to talk about the necessity of defining and clarifying. Because if we're going to think in terms of movemental nature of the church, we've got to recognize that within the context of movements as a whole, especially in times of complexity, the more simple, coherent, concise, clear, and defined what we say and how we use language matters. Language is an incredibly important factor in collecting people together and moving them together within the context of a common vision. And I'm always looking to clarify the language that I use when I'm working with people and helping churches make the shifts necessary in these complex times as they lead their congregations. I want to start off, if you're looking at today's PowerPoint, I want to start off with a great quote, I think just from N.T. Wright, that is just powerful. It says, "The method of the kingdom will match the message of the kingdom. The kingdom will come as the church, energized by the Spirit, goes out into the world, vulnerable, suffering, praising, praying, misunderstood, misjudged, vindicated, celebrating, always, as Paul puts it in one of his letters, bearing in the body the dying of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may be also displayed." I love this quote just because, again, it pulls us back to our why, this idea that the kingdom is our why. Bearing witness to this kingdom as the church is the why behind what we do and how we do what we do. Now, let's go down to the next slide where it says the power of clarity. And I've got some statements here that I kind of want to navigate with you here a little bit. It says, people do not know what we mean if we don't know what we mean. And so this is the first thing that I would say to us, that if we've not clarified our why, if we don't have a clear sense of what our mission and vision as a church is, if we're not clearly articulating our values, if we've not really done the hard work of really defining what we mean by the terms that we use, then people will not know what we mean. And any ambiguity or a lack of clarity in terminology and language gives openness to interpretation, which can lead to a breakdown in the cohesion of a community and the ability for a community to move forward in meaningful ways collectively. We can't know what we mean if we've not clarified what we mean. So not only do we have to conceptually understand it, we have to learn how to articulate it. People won't be able to say what we mean if we've not told them what we mean in a way that they can remember what we mean. And one of the things we're going to talk about is simplifying our language and giving them hooks and handles that they can hold on to as they make their way forward. What we mean only means something if we live as though what we mean matters. So in terms of mission, vision, values, in terms of even the way in which we understand our discipleship and our theology, we can be clear in our definition of it. We can speak a good language of it. But if it's not fleshed out and embodied in the way in which we live, it doesn't matter that much. What we mean only matters if it can be remembered, restated, and reproduced. And so we've got to see ourselves not as simply the arbingers of content and clarity, but we have to disseminate that out and democratize it into the life of our congregation so that it can be put on constant repeat within the lives of our people and then reproduced in the actions in the way in which they speak to others about those very things. The problem with the Christian movement, and one of the things that I think causes us to struggle as Christians, as a movement, is that our language is often so complicated. We forget that people don't understand the complexity of the theological language and terminology that we throw around, the Christianese that seems to come so naturally to some of us. And I'm not talking about keeping the cookies on the bottom shelf. That's not what I'm doing here at all. And I think that's been the interpretation in the past, is that we've got to give them the substance, the meaty stuff, or we're just simplifying, dumbing it down. That's not the only two options. One of the most profound options, I think, is learning to become a powerful interpreter and translator of key significant theological terms and ideas and concepts in a ways that can be received without having to learn a second language, which is oftentimes what we force our people to do, but can be received and then embodied in the practice of their lives. And so what I've done here is I've given you some examples of what I mean. Now, this is not exhaustive, and this is not all the ways in which I've talked in the past, but I've given you some examples of the ways in which I've done this. And now, you're going to hear certain phrases and terminology come up with me over and over again. And if you were sitting in my congregation, a lot of this terminology would be reinforced week after week after week. And so when I talk about defining and clarifying, and you're going to see this in another slide, I'm not talking about you give your congregation a vocabulary list. It's you become consistent in the way in which you use phrases and terminology so that people understand with clarity what you mean. So when I talk about Jesus, I might say something like, he's the hinge on which all of human history swings. It talks about the centrality of Jesus. When I talk about the Spirit, I talk about God's presence with us, in us, and through us as we live steeped in this Jesus journey, as we live out our day-to-day life in the fray and in the mix of what God is doing in this world. The mission, when the people of God, living by the Spirit of God, are sent out into the world for the sake of the kingdom of God. I'll say phrases like this. Now, I'm not going to go through every single phrase that I use here. Evangelism, another super easy one. Good newsing people in the way in which we live and in the way in which we talk. Getting saved. We would often talk in our church about just saying yes to Jesus. And what we meant by that is that we're saying yes not only to the salvation that comes through Jesus, but his lordship. When we talk about the lordship of Jesus, we talk in terms of stories. Oftentimes, when you hear us talk about conversion in some of the churches that I've pastored, we'll talk about getting a new story and living into a new story. The lordship of Jesus is basically handing the pen over to Jesus, because oftentimes we get saved, we want the new story, but we want to hold on to the pen in case we want to pen our next chapter. But we come to realize I'm not a very good author, and so the lordship of Jesus is handing over the pen and allow him to become the author of our story. I'll talk about sin in terms of Fleetwood Mac. You can go your own way. There's little ways in which we talk about certain phrases, concepts, and theology in ways that our people can hold on to, embrace it, and move forward in it, so that there's a sense of clarity and unity and cohesion behind how we talk and we engage the concepts that we're regularly involved in. This is an interesting slide, but I do find it to be a helpful slide. Steve Bannon, who was a former White House counsel and an all-around interesting fellow, to say the least, once said, "We got elected with 3 statements: drain the swamp, build the wall, and lock her up." And there's something profound in what he is saying there, because if there's one thing that the MAGA movement of 2016 understood, is they understood the power of shared expression and repetition. Movements operate by clear expressions that are embraced by people. Movements do not thrive in a lack of in the midst of ambiguity. movements thrive because people have clarified their statements. We can see this in the Me Too movement, in the Black Lives Matter movement, in the MAGA movement. Their why is clear, and they're appealing to something compelling in people's lives. Now, that compelling can be victimhood, it can be hope, it can be justice, it can be fear. There's a number of elements that can be appealed to, but movements, they avoid ambiguity, they clarify shared expressions, and they speak in such a way to consistently and repetitiously articulate the core assumptions, values, perspectives, and stories of the people, right? There's clarity with shared expression. Shared expressions is a means by which we share language, a way of perceiving and being in the world. We share expressions, and that reinforces who we are, what we value, what we're about, what we do. And what I'm saying to you here is this is not just a call to be clever, okay? And I want to reinforce that. This is a call to be clear, contextually clear. My list, my clear expressions wouldn't be the same as yours. And you need to be okay with that and respond to that in a way that makes sense in your context. I'm going to give you in the next lecture just a few examples of what clarified shared expressions were and have been in my local congregations, and then what we'll then do is build upon that idea of clarity in the way in which we curate stories, okay?